Hi class, this is Sir Alex Pasco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. Today we are going to discuss the continuation of our lesson 7. We're still in the basic principles of animal form and function. So this is part 2, wherein we are going to discuss various ways on how animals thermoregulate. When we talk about thermoregulation, it's basically the ability of the animal or a species or an organism to regulate their internal temperatures, which is actually very important because if the internal temperature of an animal or any species or organisms go past the normal range, it can be very detrimental to its survivability. As for us, we know that we have to keep at a certain temperature of about 37 degrees. Anything higher than that, we tend to have fever, and if that fever keeps increasing, we can have situations like we're having delirious and other stuff that can be very dangerous to our survivability. So internal temperature is actually very important in maintaining a lot of the basic physiological processes that is happening in our body. Because if our body is too cold, more specifically in terms of humans, if our internal temperature is too cold or too hot, a lot of the physiological processes happening in our body stops or becomes abnormal, and that could again be detrimental to our survivability. So that's a lot of the topic that we are going to discuss today. So let's begin with discussing what we call a feedback control loops. Feedback control loops are basically a circuit. You can think of it as circuit or a pattern that the body employs in order for us or in order for our internal temperature to maintain a certain homeostasis. You may be familiar with the word homeostasis, but we will discuss that later on. But this is necessary because basically, as we live in this earth, we know that temperature or the environmental conditions wherein we live actually changes. More specifically, with countries that has 4 seasons, around the seasons of December, November, January, this is the winter season wherein the temperature is much more colder. So the organisms that live in those certain temperatures, for example, the winter season, has to thermoregulate their body in order to compensate for the loss of heat in their environment. Uh, in situations like us here in the Philippines, we're in during summer season wherein it's really hot. Without this feedback control loops or without these patterns or circuits that are running in our body, we can actually have situations wherein we're having heat stroke, and that is can be very dangerous to a lot of people and can actually cause death, specifically to our senior citizens. So let's discuss a little bit more about what we call or in ways that animals can thermoregulate. An animal can thermoregulate depending on whether they are regulators or a conformer. A regulator animal, which are usually mostly endotherms, they were able to regulate their internal body temperature through internal mechanisms. So when we talk about internal mechanism, basically there are certain mechanisms inside our body that helps us regulate our temperature. This could be hormonal, this could be our nervous system, and a lot of those thermoregulation is actually happening via our hormones and our nervous system. Animals can also regulate their temperature by being a conformer. When we talk about from the word conform itself, what the animals do when they are conformer is they actually conform or they follow the temperature that is present surrounding them. So they basically regulate their internal temperature by adapting to the temperature of their surrounding via various behavior. Example of behavior. An example of these is a lizard. When a lizard feels too cold, what they do is they actually stay outside, find a stone that may have a heat onto it, and they use various methods such as conduction, wherein there's a heat transfer. So conduction, the heat from the stone is being transferred to their body when it's too cold. Another way is playing themselves under the sun so that the heat of the sun would warm up their body. A lot of conformers are actually what we call an ectotherms, and later we will discuss the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. So why is this thermoregulation or control of the body internal body temperature is important? Well, because our body again has to live within a certain range of survivability. So if we actually kind of like draw it in this way, so let me just choose this and have a pen. So if we are going to draw it this way, so this is a range, so we can have this as our too cold and too hot, right? So our body is in between a certain point called a set point, wherein this is the perfect balance between not being too cold and not being too hot. And anywhere near the extreme, if we go outside or too close to this extreme, can be very dangerous to our system, because a lot of the things that are happening in our body stops when it's too cold, and a lot of the things in our body stops when it's too hot. For example, a lot of the proteins that are very important in our body, we've discussed a lot about proteins. For example, a lot of the receptors in our body are made up of proteins, right? And if these proteins are subjected into a temperature that is too hot, they become denatured. When we talk about denaturing of proteins, they lose their 3D folding. Remember, when we talk about proteins, they have to fold, right? So when they fold, that's the only way that they can do their job. But when it's too hot, a lot of the proteins becomes too denatured, and when they become denatured, they unfold, and when they unfold, they do not do their job because the 3D folding that they have to be in is not there anymore. And when that happens, when a lot of our proteins are not functioning anymore, it can be very dangerous to our life. So within this set of range, or this set point, this perfect point right here, our body wants to maintain our temperature within this set point. And it's not a perfect, because our environmental conditions change. This is just a point that is perfect for us, but our body is actually fluctuating between a little being too cold and a little too hot, and that is normal. And that fluctuation is what we call a homeostasis. It is a steady state wherein we have a set point that our body wants to be in, but our body, again, because of the changing environmental conditions, our body is actually, more specifically for our internal conditions, our internal temperature is actually moving back and forth along this set point. It's not specifically within that point itself. It either moves a little on this side, or sometimes it moves over to this side depending on the environmental conditions. What is important is that it stays within the normal range, because if at any point in time that our internal conditions fall beyond the normal range, what happens is that again it becomes very dangerous to our survivability. And that's why when this set of conditions, this our body temperature falls outside of the normal range, we had feedback control loops. What happens is that when the fluctuations fall outside the normal range and too far from the set point, what happens is our body creates that falling outside of the normal range creates a stimulus which then received by the sensor, which then our body creates a response, and this response will trigger um, a mechanism in our body that will uh, for example, maybe the body temperature becomes a little too hot, then this being too hot right here will become a stimulus that will be received by the sensor in our body, and our body will create a response that will pull back this being too hot to a little to fall back within the set normal range, and that is what we call a feedback control loops. And in our body, there's actually two circuit system that is happening. The first one is called the negative feedback loop, wherein this is the most common one when we talk about feedback control loops, which is when the response of the body is to lower or dampen the stimulus. Another feedback that we have is what we call a positive feedback, which is a response of our body that amplifies the stimulus. So I don't want you guys to get confused with these two. If positive feedback, it's easy to remember because it amplifies. When something is being amplified, it becomes stronger. It adds to the intensity. But for negative feedback, it doesn't, even though we mean it lowers the stimulus or it dampens the stimulus, you will notice from our coming example that it's not always the case. Okay, so let's look at this example of a negative feedback. So we have our set point. This is our body at a normal range. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. But when our body's temperature suddenly decreases because perhaps it's too cold, there's loss of temperature, it's winter, what happens is that the body creates a heating process inside us. And later we would learn some various heating process that is happening in our body. But one of the things that I've actually told you guys a lot of times is, for example, shivering. Moving of the muscles actually creates a heat in our body. So when it's too cold, the reason that you shiver, it's because your body is telling, is because your body is your the nervous system in your body is telling your muscles to vibrate and to shiver in order to create heat. And what happens is that it creates this negative feedback that the decrease, which is the stimulus, and a sensor in our brain receives that and it creates a response of shivering. So this is now your response, and then the result is it increases the body temperature. So this is your feedback loop. Okay, so what happens is that it moves in the opposite direction. So when there's a decrease in temperature, in the body temperature, the body will shiver to increase temperature. But it's not always decrease and then increase. Sometimes it can also even be a increase of the body temperature, but this time it's a little too hot for our body set point. It's too far from our body set point. What happens then is it creates another cooling system inside us, which is an example of sweating. So the reason that you are sweat when it's too hot is because your body is trying to cool itself. And when you sweat, later I will explain how sweating actually decreases the temperature. What happens is that this increase in temperature then becomes a decrease. So negative feedback is actually not a very good term because it doesn't always lowers the stimulus. It doesn't always mean to make it lower. The negative feedback is just means that what suddenly increases we are trying to decrease, or what suddenly decreases we are trying to increase. So that is what we call a negative feedback loop. The positive feedback loop, like I've mentioned, is a little more easier to remember because what happens is that it actually increases the stimulus. One of the greatest example in our body is, for example, for pregnant women when they're about to go into labor. What happens is that as the baby grows, the baby keeps growing for 9 months, right? Until it's such a way that the head of the baby, if it is not, kung hindi siya suhi, no? Kung yung head is directed towards the vagina canal, wherein the baby would pass through, what happens is that there are some receptors in the uterus that would actually signal that the baby is fully developed. And this stretching and when these receptors receive that signal of stretch, what happens is that the brain signals for the release of an oxytocin. Oxytocin, which is a hormone, is actually responsible for the contraction of the uterine wall. So when there is an increased production of oxytocin inside the pregnant woman's body, you have to expect that there would start a contraction in their uterus, and that would actually signal um, that the baby is about to be born. And what actually happens is because of this increase, so far we received this signal, right? The signal is that the receptors were stretched, and then they and then the sensor signals to the brain to release the oxytocin, and then the oxytocin results in the contraction of the uterine wall. What happens then is that this increase in contraction of the wall will actually result to even stronger contraction until the baby is delivered. So what you see is that the contraction is not decreasing. What this loop is doing, this positive feedback is doing, is actually increasing the contraction even more. And the reason that it wants to do that is because to help aid in the birth of the baby. If there's no contraction happening, the reason that giving birth is very painful because of this construction. But without this, no, the pregnant lady would have a hard time giving birth. So again, so for negative feedback loop, we're basically dampening, or we are reversing the effect that is happening in the body. As for the positive feedback loop, we are increasing. No, we want to increase what is happening in the body. So for our example, the pregnant lady. But another thing that is actually interesting to a lot of the um, animals in the world is that they have the ability to what we call acclimatization. Acclimatization is when an animals become accustomed to its new climate or to a new condition. You can think of it this way. So we as Filipinos, maybe you were born in the Philippines and then you suddenly moved to a much more colder country. So there is a change in the temperature where you are living. So for example, Canada. Some areas in Canada are always cold, no? What happens then is that your body will start to acclimatize. It will actually start um, to become more accustomed to the new climate or to the new conditions that you're living. And this is different from a natural selection, which we discussed previously. Acclimatization, there is no natural selection happening. It's just that your body basically changes your normal range, or it can actually also change your set point. So perhaps the normal range that you have in the Philippines, you want to keep your body within, let's say, 35 to 37 degrees Celsius. That is the normal range. Anything above that, 38 degrees Celsius, you're slowly having a fever. 39 is already a fever, something like that. But when you, for example, move to a much more colder country, your normal range then can probably be around, let's say, about 20 to 22 degree Celsius. So that becomes your normal range. And if your body is um that's actually a very bad example, because the internal temperature of the body does not actually change, but this is just an example. So this is what acclimatization does, and this is what a lot of animals tend to do. They change their normal range depending on the new environment or the new climate that they are in. So this is how the body thermoregulates or some of the functions on how the body thermoregulates. We have these feedback loops. Now let's look at some more examples on how animals actually thermoregulate, and we'll also discuss the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. Thermoregulation for a lot of animals actually involves a lot of the form, function, and behavior in animals. Without this form in the body, without the various functions that the body possesses, and a lot of the behaviors that a lot of mammals and a lot of animals possesses, thermoregulation will not happen. Thermoregulation, again, is basically just the process wherein the animal maintain its internal temperature. And again, this is important because if our internal temperature is not within the set range or set point and does not fall on the normal range, this could actually be detrimental to our survivability. So the body can either gain or lose heat. And for a lot of animals, they can gain or lose heat via internal metabolism or by external environment. So this is will lead us to the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. Endothermic animals or an endotherm actually uses the metabolic heat to regulate the body temperature. So metabolic heat is related to our internal mechanisms. That's why a lot of endothermic are actually regulators. They can regulate their own body temperature using various inner body mechanics, because a lot of endothermic uses their own metabolic heat or the heat that the body produces to regulate their temperature. As for ectothermic animals or ectotherms, or later I guess later we'll discuss that. So another thing about endothermic is that they can maintain a stable body temperature. So the temperature of endotherms does not fall outside of normal range or outside of the set point easily. The temperature, especially the internal temperature of an endotherm, is very set. Also, they have the ability to generate heat when it's cold or cool off when it's too hot. So even though we keep talking about metabolic heat, this metabolic heat or this regulation of body temperature can either generate heat or can either cool off the person. So it can lower or it can increase your body temperature. Again, ectothermic animals are animals that gains are different from endothermic is that ectothermic or ectothermic animals or ectotherms actually regulates their body temperature by gaining heat from external environments. So they rely on the environment to either lose or gain heat. And that is why a lot of ectothermic animals, such as a lot of lizards, actually require much less food than endotherms because they are not creating their own heat. They are getting the heat from the outside environment. Unlike us humans or a lot of mammals, which are endothermic, we actually eat a lot of food. And one of the main reasons that we eat food is because of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, which is related to our metabolism, actually creates and generates heat. The mitochondria, the cellular respiration that is happening in our mitochondria, is actually generating heat that helps us regulate our body temperature. So for animals that are ectothermic, they require less food because they do not have to make their own heat in the body. They can actually just get the heat that they need from the environment. Moreover, ectothermic animals are more tolerable from larger fluctuations. So the set point that they have and the normal range that they have between this temperature is much larger compared to endothermic animals. Lastly, ectothermic animals seek heat via behavioral means. So they can gain this external environmental heat or they can gain this heat from outside the environment via behavioral means. If for us, if we want to cool off or increase our temperature, we use a lot of inner mechanisms. But for a lot of the animals that are ectothermic, they do not have to undergo a lot of internal mechanisms. What they just have to do is behavioral means, which are some examples that I already gave earlier. For example, a lizard that is feeling too cold may go outside and sit on a warm stone, and the heat from the stone via conduction would actually heat the animal. Also, they can display themselves and stretch themselves under the sun to actually bask, or basically nagsasunbathing sila, which actually also help them gain internal heat, or they can gain heat, which again this heat comes from external environment, and this process is actually called radiation. So that is the difference between an endothermic and an ectothermic animal, or an endotherm or an ectotherm. Another thing though is this being an endothermic and ectothermics basically just tells you how your body gains or releases heat. But there's also another term that we are going to learn called the poikilotherm and the homeotherm. This is a little different from an endotherm and an ectotherm. Poikilotherms are basically that the animals can actually vary their temperature. So the normal temperature that they have can change depending on the environment. Please do not get confused, okay? Homeotherm, poikilotherm is usually what we call the cold-blooded animals. Their temperature changes depending on their environment. And then we have what we call an homeotherm. Homeotherm are animals that their temperature is relatively stable. So you can image, you may think also, isn't that just an endotherm? Well, not really. We know endotherms are animals which has a stable or relatively stable body temperature, right? And ectotherm are animals that has larger fluctuations in their body heat. But moreover, endotherm is more specifically talking about how how the animals regulate their body temperature, and endotherms regulate their body temperature via inner mechanism. Therefore, endotherms can actually be either a homeotherm or a poikilotherm. Homeotherm is what we call our warm-blooded animals. So sir, these are some of the examples. We usually think of homeotherm as endotherm because a lot of endotherms are actually homeotherm. But in reality, some of the endotherm, such as this naked mole rat here, are actually poikilotherms. That is because a naked mole rat can still regulate its body temperature using inner mechanism. It does not need to get heat from the outside environment, which what ectotherm does. But more specifically, a naked mole rat is actually also a poikilotherm because the temperature within its body can either be a little higher or can either be a little lower depending on its outside environment. And it can change that temperature via inner mechanisms. And because they can change their temperature depending on their environment, they're poikilotherms. And this change of temperature happens via inner mechanisms. They are endotherm. So please do not get confused with endotherm being a warm-blooded, but that is actually not. That's a misnomer. It's not real because some of the endotherm are actually poikilotherm. So a lot of endothermic animals which can regulate their body temperature using inner mechanisms can change their body temperature depending on the environment. And same situation, a lot of ectotherms, which we know as cold-blooded, such as lizard, can also are not all kilotherm. We know that lizards are per kilotherm because they can actually change their temperature depending on the environment, and that makes sense because an ectotherm gains their heat from the environment. So therefore, if they are in a temperature, or if they are in an environment with a lower temperature, their temperature in their body is much lower. If they're in a environment wherein the temperature is much higher, then their body temperature will be much higher, right? That is true. But some ectotherm, such as these animal right here, which is an anglerfish, right here, is an ectotherm because it also relies its body temperature on its environment, and because they are living in much more stable in an environment which with much more stable temperature, they are homeotherm. Their body temperature does not relative, or the temperature inside the body of the fish right here does not usually change, simply because the temperature in their environment does not change. So they are ectotherm, but since because their body temperature does not really change that much, because their environmental conditions does specifically the temperature of their environment does not change that much, then they are homeotherm. So please do not get confused these four words: endotherm, ectotherm, homeotherm, and poikilotherm. So this is what just I mentioned. There's no fixed relationship between these four. No, you can be an endotherm and still be an homeotherm or a poikilotherm. Okay, so I hope that is clear. Next, let's talk about how the animals can actually regulate the exchange of heat in their environment. So we talk a lot about our ectotherms. Ectotherms regulate their heat via their environment. So how they can actually regulate their heat via the environment? There are four ways. The first one is via radiation. So like the examples that I gave, some lizard, when it's too cold, they go out under the sun, and the heat from the sun, the infrared rays, would actually warm up their body. So they spread themselves under the sun, and they actually receive heat from the sun. And this heat from the infrared rays of the sun is called radiation. Another is called an evaporative cooling or evaporation. A lot of ectothermic animals and even also endothermic animals can actually release heat from the body. So when it's too, or when their body is too hot, they can actually release heat via evaporation. So let me explain why. An example of an evaporation cooling is sweating. When water, H2O, evaporation, remember, evaporation is basically when we turn liquid, for example, liquid water, to a gaseous waters, right? We evaporate from liquid to gas. When that happens, when a liquid turns to gas, it requires a lot of energy to do so. So it requires a lot of energy to do this. So where do this energy come from? This energy comes from the body of the animal. So the what happens is when you sweat, right? When it's too hot, you sweat. You see the sweat on your skin, and then eventually this water on your skin, this sweat will actually evaporate, and when it evaporates, you feel much more cooler. Maybe parang you feel sticky, pero you feel much more cooler than the previous compared to before you sweat. The reason for that is because when the water on your skin evaporates, it traps some of the energy that your body has, which energy is also related to temperature, right? So the higher the energy, the higher the temperature. So when this energy is used to convert liquid water to a gaseous water, that energy is used, that energy is dissipated, which results in cooling your body down. So that is another way that exchange of heat is happening onto an animal within its environment. The next one is what we call a convection. Convection is basically the heat transfer from the movement of air or liquid. So, kapag nahanginan ka, so kapag sobrang init, what do you do? Nagpapahangin ka. Or binubuksan mo yung air conditioner, tama? So, when it's too hot, you close everything down, you turn on the conditioner. The reason that the house starts to become cooler is because of convection. It's because of the air flowing. Another example of convection is when it's too hot, you're in the oceans, so you feel the sea breeze cooling you down. That is convection. There's heat transfer, there's a release of heat via the breeze that is flowing from the ocean into the land para nawawala yung heat, no? Kaya marami nagsiswimming kapag summer kasi yung sea breeze, it's much more colder on the closer you are to the water. Simple na lang, no? Convection. Kapag nagtimpla kayo ng kape, hinihipan nyo, di ba? The reason that you are blowing it to cool it down is because of convection. That's one of the simplest thing that I can think of for to explain convection. Okay, so the fourth one, or the last one, is via conduction. Conduction is basically the transfer of heat via physical contact. So as you can see here, this iguana right here wants to receive heat by sitting on a rock that is much hotter. And what happens is that the transfer of energy or the transfer of heat is usually from a temperature that is much lower compared to a temperature that is much higher. If the temperature of the rock is much more higher than the temperature of the animal, some of the heat will be transferred to that animal. But if you change this, if you have a temperature that is much more higher to you and a temperature that is much more cooler, then the thing that you want to contact, then the temperature would be transferred from your body to that object. And where do we see this? Kapag linalagnat kayo. The reason that your parents put cold towel on top of your head is to seep that heat out of your head. Okay, that is an example of conduction. Okay, I hope these 4 examples are clear. So a lot of these processes are very, very related to our integumentary system. Our integumentary system is basically the organs or the system that consists of our skin, hair, and nails. Because our skin, hair, and nails are actually very important in a lot of these mechanisms: radiation, evaporation, conduction, and convection. More specifically sa buhok natin, or more specifically the fur on the animals. The fur on the animals actually offers what we call an insulation. Insulation, it helps them lower the flow of heat between the animals and the environment, meaning they retain heat. The reason that we, during winter, sobrang daming nagfa-fur coat, no? It's because the insulation that is on those fur. When those fur traps air onto the fur, they actually could retain more heat. So during winter, or when it's very cold, which is during winter, what happens is that a lot of these animals would actually raise their fur, or you can actually see these on birds. They actually raise their feather, and by raising their feather, it's trapping more air. And when air is more trapped, they become more insulated, meaning the warmth is kept onto their body. And we actually see this on our skin. Kapag sobrang lamig, ano yung napapansin nyo sa skin nyo? Nagkakaroon kayo ng goosebump. Tama? These goosebumps are actually from our ancestors that has fair fur long time ago. And when it's too cold, they raises their fur and they trap heat. No, the reason that we still have these goosebumps is just vestigial. Remember our discussion about natural selection and vestigial. So vestigial organs are basically organs that originally has a purpose before and it doesn't have a purpose anymore now, no? So pero nangyayari pa rin siya. Nakikita nyo na nagre-raise yung skin nyo, nagkakaroon kayo ng chicken skin, you're having goosebump kapag sobrang lamig. That is just because a long time ago, our ancestors, when they're too cold, they raises their fur, they raises their feathers to trap more heat onto their fur to warm themselves up. Okay? Another thing that is very important that still plays in our integumentary system is vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vasodilation is basically the increase of the diameter of our artery. So think of this as our artery, and this is blood right here. This is our blood. This is where your blood flows. By vasodilating, from the word dilation, you're increasing the size, you're increasing the diameter of your artery. What happens? There's more blood increase in blood flow. So underneath your skin, kapag sobrang init or kapag sobrang lamig, ano nangyayari? The arteries under your skin actually vasodilates, and that increases the blood flow, and that actually increases the temperature on your skin to help you of not to feel too cold. And then when it's too hot man, or when it's too hot naman, ano nangyayari? Nagkakaroon ng vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is it's decreasing it's decreasing the diameter of your artery, and when there's a decrease in diameters, the blood flow is much less, and when there's less blood flow that is traveling underneath your skin, you feel much more cooler. So kapag sobrang init, the skin lowers the temperature to cool you off. So this is another way that our body actually thermoregulates, that is still related to our integumentary system, our skin, hair, and nails. And these whole processes of radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction are all are also related to our integumentary system. Okay, so I hope that is clear. Next, there's another way that animals, more specifically animals that are in very extreme temperature, or their limbs, their extremities, yung paa nila or yung kamay nila are always in temperatures that are cold. They have what we call a countercurrent exchange. A countercurrent exchange is basically when there's a transfer of heat from the artery to the vein. When we discuss later the difference between an artery and a vein, arteries carries blood from the heart. So they basically carries blood from the core into your extremities. And they are much warmer. The reason for that is because this is a misnomer that I will explain later on. But think of it, arteries are basically oxygenated. They carries the oxygenated blood. Although this is not fully true, but for now we're gonna keep it this way. And then we have another set of capillaries, another set of tubes that carries blood called veins. Veins are tubes that carries unoxygenated blood. So they're the one that is carrying the blood from our extremities, from our limbs, back into our heart so that it will be pumped and be oxygenated, and then it will move from our veins to our arteries, which will then, these arteries will go it from our into our bodies or our extremities. So that is the difference between arteries and a vein. And these two, arteries and veins, are actually very close together. So example like this for a bird right here, or example like a duck. No? Yung mga paa nila, usually a duck, they're always in the water. Nagbababad sila, tama? And some birds actually has their feet always in, for example, a very snowy mountain or snowy snow or very cold conditions. So in order to warm their extremities or to warm their limbs, there's actually a transfer of heat because the blood in the arteries is the temperature of the blood in the arteries is actually much more hotter than the blood that is in the so yung temperature niya mas maliit compared din sa blood uh, na nandun sa vein. So what happens is that the blood in the arteries, which again comes from the core body, so that the blood is actually much warmer, so the heat is actually being transferred via conduction, basically just by physical contact because the vein and the artery are close together. So what happens is that the blood on the vein is still being warmed up, hindi siya sobrang lamig. So why is this important? It's because it helps reduce heat loss from the extremities. So kapag imagine if this bird right here, they always step onto the snow. So parang imagine if you keep stepping the snow, no? The reason that their feet is not being bothered is because not much heat is being lost. Hindi sobrang lamig yung paa nila because of the countercurrent exchange. Okay. Okay, so that is another way that the body thermoregulates. Another one is that many animals thermoregulates via cooling and warming. A lot of the animals not only has to keep themselves warm, but also has to keep themselves cool off. One way to cool off is evaporative cooling, which was already explained earlier. Sweating. Sweating is an example of evaporation wherein when this water right here moves from being a liquid to a gas, it requires energy, and it takes the energy that is on your body as that heat and uses that to turn it from liquid to gas, and that energy is dissipated from your body, lowering your temperature. But for animals such as this I think it's a wolf right here, but halimbawa kung may pet kayo na aso, kung napapansin nyo na parang nagpa-pant siya, no? Yung nakalabas na yung dila niya, tapos parang siyang hinihingal. The reason that your dog is doing that is because they're trying to cool off their body. That is also an example of an evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling does not only happen via sweating, but even breathing. Some of the animals, when they breathe, for example, yung nagpa-pant na to, no? It's a type of it's another type of evaporative cooling. They actually release a lot of heat via panting. So if you actually take your dog into a hiking and napansin niyo na sobrang nagpapant na yung aso nyo, it means that your dog is feeling really hot. So it's probably a time for you to rest and let the dog find a shade or let the dog rest, no? So that is an indicative kapag sobrang nagpapant na sila na sobrang init. That is how they release their heat. Another is crocodiles. So if you've seen the crocodiles with their mouth open, the reason na naka-open your mouth nila is not because they're waiting for food to eat. It's because by opening their mouth, they're actually releasing a lot of heat as well. So that is also another example of an evaporative cooling. Another way that animals also thermoregulate is via behavioral responses. So another some examples is migration and hibernation. So kapag sobrang lamig na, a lot of birds actually migrate. They move from an area which is much more colder to an area which is much more warmer, wherein there's also a lot of food. Also hibernation, examples bear. During winter, the bear conserves heat in their body by sleeping. So by sleeping, they insulate their body and they retain a lot of their heat by not moving too much, because when you move, you use energy. Tama. And when you move and you keep using your energy, you're losing a lot of heat. So bears hibernate to keep their heat onto themselves during winter. So this type of thermoregulation is behavioral responses. So these are another examples. So kapag nagpapainit si lizard, or kapag kung nakapanood na kayo ng video wherein the Um, the elephant, parang nagsinghot siya ng tubig sa nose, sa trunk niya, and then it showers itself. That is also a behavioral. So naliligo sila kasi sobrang init, it's trying to cool itself. Another is kapag sobrang init, you will see a lot of animals finding shade, or some animals congregating together. So they share their body heat by basically nagkukumpulan sila. Kapag sobrang lamig, kapag nagkumpulan sila, mas nagsishare sila ng body heat, so they retain heat. So these are some examples of behavioral responses that animals do to thermoregulate. Hindi lahat nangyayari in inside the system sa katawan natin. A lot of the things also happen behaviorally. Lastly, heat production strategies ng mga endotherms. Endotherms, remember, are just animals wherein their temperature is a lot more stable and they thermoregulate their bodies via metabolism. One way that they can actually produce heat, because endotherms actually keep their body temperature relatively higher than their environment. No? So kapag nagkakaroon ng loss of heat, a lot of endotherms produce heat. And one way to produce heat is via muscular activity, via shivering. Some are non-shivering thermoregulation. So, hindi lahat about shivering. Some is increased metabolic activity. Remember the mitochondria, respiration, cellular respiration actually creates heat. The production of ATP does not cellular respiration does not only produce ATP, but it also produces a lot of metabolic activity, or a lot of heat. Also, you have what we call brown fat, and these brown fats are usually found along your neck and along your shoulder. And these brown fats are actually found to be specialized in producing heat. So kapag sobrang linalamig ka, the brown fat found on your neck and your shoulder actually helps you to keep you warm. And lastly, there are this not only endotherms, but some of the reptiles, which some reptiles are actually ectotherm, they become endotherm. So an example is a python boa. So kapag nag-incubate siya ng itlog niya, the female python, no? Kapag nag-incubate siya ng heat niya, yung python, despite being an ectotherm, they behave as an endotherm. They produce body heat via metabolism to actually insulate their egg, para mainitan yung egg para mapisa, lumabas yung baby. So these are another thermoregulation sa mga endotherms naman. And lastly, there's thermoregulation, more specifically sa humans, is very, very complex. And it is actually regulated via a brain organ, not organ, what is the word, there's a brain, I forget the term, but it's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So if you see the red right there, that is the hypothalamus, found basically very inside your brain. It is found just underneath the thalamus and above the pituitary gland, and it actually has a lot of function. One of its function is a lot of your drinking and your eating is actually regulated by your thalamus. A lot of our thermoregulation is also regulated by the thalamus. Basically, the thalamus is yung thermostat ng body ninyo. It's the one telling your body that it's too hot and it's too cold. It's the one receiving the signal, telling you consciously that it's too hot and it's too small. More specifically, the thalamus also is the center that relays a signal to the muscles and the organs, or to the nervous system, telling your body to either increase your temperature kapag sobrang lamig, or to decrease your temperature kapag sobrang init. And the thalamus does this via, for example, the vasodilation and the vasoconstriction. So kapag sobrang nilalamig ka, ang gagawin ng hypothalamus, marireceive niya yung signal, sasabihin niya, oh, it's too cold. So the hypothalamus would actually signal your nervous system to signal your blood vessels to vasodilate. And and your vessels vasodilate, there's an increased flow of blood under your skin, which then warms your skin, which warms up your body. And kung sobra namang init, your hypothalamus will receive a signal telling your body, wow, it's too hot. So the hypothalamus would signal your nervous system and your other parts of your body, and then the nervous system, more specifically, will signal your blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And when it vasoconstricts, there's less blood flow, and when there's less blood flow, there's a lower temperature on your skin, which then lowers your temperature. So that is the job of the hypothalamus. And lastly, your body also undergo what we call a fever. So kapag nagkaroon ka ng viral or bacterial infection, madalas linalagnat ka. Example, flu. Flu is actually a viral infection of the influenza virus. And seriously, walang gamot sa viral infections, no? More specifically, not all viral infections, but specifically flu. So kapag umiinom kayo ng VioFlu, it's actually not, or biogesic, those are actually not treatment. It's just treating the symptoms of flu. But you cannot actually just remove yung flu, no? The best way to actually treat a flu is just to let your body recuperate. And one way that your body actually fights that infection is via increasing the temperature. And we're not gonna go deep into this because it's actually very, very highfalutin. It's very detailed, and we're not gonna do that. But your body increases your temperature to fight off these bacterial or viral infections. So linalagnat kayo. The reason for that is because your immune system is fighting for your survivability. So that is another way of thermoregulation as well. So that is all our lesson for today. If you guys have any question, please do not hesitate to message me. Thank you so much, guys, and may you guys have a great day.